we're going to do is, most of this will be a conversation. We're going to have two short presentations at the beginning. I'll introduce the first one, and then I'll introduce the second one, and then I'll introduce the panelists here in a moment. So we'll start off by hearing from Ben Abbott, who is professor of ecology at BYU. He's also executive director of an organization called Grow the Flow. And Ben is going to be talking to us just to give us a little update about what's going on with the state of our lake. All right, Ben, thanks.
Thank you very much, Brig, and thanks to all of you for being here. I came up in a BYU vehicle, but they still let me park here. It was amazing. So breaking down stereotypes. Does anybody know what this is a picture of? The Caspian Sea. Nailed it, front row. So it's the largest saline lake on the planet. Sarah gave a beautiful overview of this material, so I'm not going to spend too much time. But these terminal lakes contain about half of global lake water. And we sometimes fall into the thinking that they're strange ecosystems that are kind of marginal or different. Actually, it's central to the Earth's hydrological cycle, global habitat, and human flourishing on the planet. And these lakes are unique because of their hydrological balance. So I just have one equation for you today. The lake volume is equal to the runoff, which is both surface and subsurface runoff, so rivers and groundwater, plus the direct precipitation into the lake minus the evaporation from the lake. So what I want you to reflect on real quickly is, which of these parameters have we affected and how? Okay, all of them? I think we agree. Anybody want to shout out what in particular? How did we affect evaporation? So through climate change, right? Things are warmer, that increases evaporation. I heard runoff. How did we impact runoff? Diversions, right? So people, when you explain the issue, they're like, why are they taking water out of Great Salt Lake? It's salty. Well, we've diverted the fresh water upstream, right? And what about direct precipitation? Yeah, so we've tried to affect it through cloud seeding. My assessment as an independent person not under contract to do cloud seeding for the state is that there's been no impact, demonstrable impact from that cloud seeding. But I am known to get sued for making statements like that. So I probably shouldn't have started there. So here's where I put the arrows. This is the human impact. The biggest thing that we've done is we've reduced runoff, in the case of Great Salt Lake, by about half. In many years, more than half. Right? There are years where 2/3 of the natural flow that would have gotten to the lake is diverted and consumed primarily by agriculture, but also urban and industrial uses. And then the direct precipitation and the evaporation have been strongly impacted actually by two factors. One of them, climate change. The second one is the shrinkage of the lake itself. Right? The new research out of Utah State University shows that around 50% of the annual precipitation downwind of the lake comes from the lake itself. 50%. Right? That's the difference between the West Desert and the temperate urban forest that we live in here. Right? So these lakes are crucial keystones in creating local climate and habitat. And globally, there are around 120 of these lakes. And the story is the same everywhere. 60% of global saline lake area has already been lost. They occur on every continent. There even are some in Antarctica, but their area hasn't changed. So this is a global pattern. And you can look at these time series, right, from every continent, in this case, Lake Urmia in Iran, the Aral Sea, of course, and then Lake Popo in South America, one that doesn't get as much attention, but I think is just as important as the others. So 120 of these lakes around the world in decline, and there are no successful restoration stories. People sometimes say, wait, what about Mono Lake? And I've met with and spoken with the Mono Lake Committee many times. They succeeded in stopping the decline of the lake, and yet they're still feet away. It hasn't reached the legally mandated healthy level of the lake. So I'm still, and I'd be happy to be corrected on that. Well, why should we care about a salty lake? Again, you all know this, but I think of these three categories. First of all, human health that we've talked about that length. Also habitat, right? 12 million birds. If you go beyond just the migratory birds, we're talking about 450 species that depend on the lake. And then around $2.5 billion of direct economic benefit from the lake each year. That does not scratch the surface, right? I don't know of any quantitative estimate of the secondary economic impacts of the decline of the lake. Public health, property values. And we already are hearing from insurance companies out of Chicago that there are areas where they're asking questions. Should we insure that development that's downwind of Great Salt Lake? So the impacts aren't theoretical. Right? In the Future of Great Salt Lake study out of Utah State, almost 14% of the respondents said they were considering leaving Utah because of Great Salt Lake. That was not a question on the survey. They spontaneously added that to the notes at the end. So again, we're not talking about an eventual crisis. We're talking about the ongoing collapse of the lake. And as an ecologist, our first law is everything is connected to everything else. So the tendrils go right into the economy. They go right into our cultural identity. They go right into our future. And the time series are one thing. I like to look at these photos. On the left, that's Mar Chiquita. Now, Sarah's still here? Graneski. She did make one false statement. She said Great Salt Lake was the largest saline lake in the Western Hemisphere. It used to be. Mar Chiquita is now larger in Argentina. They're sister lakes. Many of the birds that are here in our summer are there in the Southern Hemisphere summer. This is a dust plume of salty dust being deposited on agricultural fields. It's about 400 kilometers long. And in fact, the agriculture in the Mar Chiquita watershed is being impacted and decreasing because of salinization of their soils. So again, these links, these connections, the Aral Sea, and then this is the one that gets me, the Urumato people of Lake Popo. They literally lived on the lake. And the Desaguadero River that comes from Lake Titicaca was diverted to grow quinoa because of increased global demand. And the local government, they blamed it on climate change. They blamed it on weather, much like what we're seeing here with Great Salt Lake. And for me, ultimately, this is a question of values. Who are we? We don't actually live in a desert, right? Utah isn't even close, northern Utah isn't close to the threshold. We have plenty of water. It's a question of where we're going to put it. And right now, the lake is at the end of that list of priorities. And I think the challenge for us is how do we put it first? Because everything else depends on the lake. Right? This isn't a question of the environment or the economy. If we care about the economy, we have to take care of our home. So where is the lake today? This is, I love the state's website for Great Salt Lake. You can get this graph updated every single day. So you can see the big dip, of course, in 2022, end of 2022. But if we look at where we are today, where we started last fall, we were about where we were in 2021. Now, we'd been at that point a couple times before. And I'm taking kind of the weighted average between the North Arm and the South Arm, just showing where we started this hydrological year. And in some ways, I love to look at this figure, right? We've rebounded from that really deep decline. A paper came out a couple weeks ago that showed that dip in 2022, about a third of it was attributable to climate change. Right? So that was a very uncommon period of multiple years of extreme drought. Now, that's very likely to happen again, potentially in the next 10 years, potentially in the next 2 years. Right? If you look at the long-term weather patterns. And so for me, the fact that we've been bouncing around at this extreme low level is actually is very alarming, because we're always going to be just a year or two away from collapse if we stay here. And so I'll just end on this slide. The state's strike team came out with a report a couple of months ago now. And their conclusion was that if we get an additional 770,000 acre feet of water to Great Salt Lake, that gives us a 45% chance of ever reaching a healthy level. So we get a coin flip for 770,000 acre feet. The current target And I'm the first to say that I don't know whether it's going to get us farther to have a really aggressive target that's enough to save the lake, or do we start with a baby step, right? One of my mentors always says, a little something is better than a big nothing, right? I don't know which path is better. But in any case, the current target is 250,000 acre feet of conservation and delivery to the lake. Right? So a third of the amount that gives us a coin flip of ever reaching a healthy level of the lake. And Kevin will talk about this in a minute, but we know that at the bottom of the healthy range, most of the dust hotspots still are active, still are exposed. Right? So, and if we're staying at that lower end of the healthy range, again, we are at the mercy of just 1 or 2 extreme drought years. So the stakes are high, and nobody has done this before, and that makes me smile because I think we can do it. I really do. We have assets that none of these other lakes have had. And I'm talking about money, but I'm also talking about cultural assets. The fact that we are so connected with our lake, the fact that so many of us live near the lake, that's been identified as a factor of ecological resilience. When more of the population is aware of and connected with an ecosystem, it's much more likely that it's protected and or restored. So I think that we can do this, but I also know that we're going to have to change a lot of things. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ben. We'll hear from Dr. Kevin Perry. Dr. Perry is a professor of atmospheric sciences here at the University of Utah, foremost expert in the state on the dust that we've been talking about today. And he'll provide us an overview of what is going on with the dust problem and what have we learned over the last couple of years.
Thank you so much, Ben, for that nice overview and optimism, because I share that optimism. We just simply can't fail. There's too much at stake, too many people. And I just want to start by saying, I heard a story from somebody who was doing educational outreach at a local elementary school. And the person was asking these fourth graders what they knew about Great Salt Lake. And they were like, well, we know it's shrinking. And then the follow-up question is, well, does that matter? Like, yeah, we're really worried about the dust, but we don't have to worry about it because the adults are going to take care of it for us, aren't they? Oof. Responsibility is something that we have to take seriously, and we have to do something about this. So I've been known as Dr. Dust because of the research that I've been doing, trying to understand the sources, the sinks, the potential health impacts of dust. And this has been going on for quite some time. Whoops, if I could just start that. Yeah, there we go. The video, if we can. There we go. So this is a video from 8 years ago. A cold front is going to pass. We're looking from the University of Utah down towards downtown. South is to the left, the lake is to the right. The winds before the storm are from the south, and the winds shift and bring in dust from Great Salt Lake into Salt Lake County. They reduced visibility to about 1.5 miles. And this was 8 years ago. And the situation has only gotten worse. But I want to basically say that although these types of dust events are the ones that get a lot of attention, they're not the only thing that impacts our community in terms of dust. There are a lot smaller events. So here's an example of a thunderstorm that formed over Great Salt Lake, and the outflow from that thunderstorm pushed dust into Salt Lake County. And there are even smaller events, even just lesser winds that are generating dust from the lake that you can't easily pick up with your eye, but the monitors that we have can show that it's there. And if you think back to Dr. Robert Payne earlier talking about the health impacts of being exposed to pollutants, that there really is no healthy level, that we have to not just look at these big dust events that all of us notice, but we have to pay attention to what's happening on a day-to-day basis as well. So in terms of Great Salt Lake, I've mapped where the dust is coming from on Great Salt Lake, and there are primarily 4 big dust sources out on Great Salt Lake. The one that's closest to the largest population is in Farmington Bay in the southeastern quadrant. The next one that's closest to where people live is in Bear River Bay in the northeastern quadrant. But we also have dust sources out near the EPA Superfund site of U.S. Magnesium, and then also in the extreme northwestern part of the lake as well. And if we just kind of look at where those dust hotspots are located, in Bear River Bay, most of those dust hotspots are located at elevations above 4,202 feet, which is a full 10 feet above where we are right now. In Farmington Bay, we have a lot more dust hotspots, and these tend to be at lower elevations. You can actually cover up a significant quantity of these dust hotspots at a lake elevation of 4,200 and get 70% coverage at 4,202. So it's actually easier to mitigate dust if you have to with water in Farmington Bay than it is Bear River Bay. But as Ben alluded to, if we look at this figure, which shows the lake level on the y-axis and the percentage of these dust hotspots that would be covered by water, we're at basically 4,193 feet right now and change, which means that all of these dust hotspots that I've measured are currently exposed. They're too wet to blow right now, but that'll change as we move into the drier season. But even if you bring that lake up to 4,198, which is what has been touted as the ecological healthy level for the lake, or the minimum ecological health for the lake, that will only cover up about 40% of the dust hotspots. Dust was the first ecological problem associated with the shrinking of the Great Salt Lake because it was exposing that area, and it'll be the last to be solved as we bring the lake level up. But we can solve it. We know what we need to do. So where does that dust go? And that's what people always want to know. And we don't have a robust monitoring network to actually demonstrate exactly where it goes. So we rely upon models. The model that Sarah Graneski was talking about from Derek Malia and the University of Utah Department of Atmospheric Sciences is the best tool that we have right now to identify where the dust is going. But what we do know is that the meteorology that drives these dust storms are cold fronts. And before a cold front hits our valley, we have really strong winds from the south that scream 25 miles an hour or more for up to 18 hours. And then as that front passes, the winds change and move from the west to the northwest, and they typically stay strong for a few hours. So if you look at the data from the airport, at Salt Lake International Airport, when we have these strong wind events that create these big dust storms, 75% of the time, the dust is moving north to communities of Layton and Syracuse and Ogden, and eventually up towards Brigham City and Cache County. And we have no monitors up there to really identify and track that dust. On the other hand, when it moves into Salt Lake County, we have more instruments to measure that, but most of them are not situated close to the lake. They tend to be further back from the lake. So where does that dust go? Well, we've got winds from the south that take it north. We got winds from the north and the west that move it. And it doesn't take it very long to impact these areas. So here, the red outline shows where the dust can be in simply 1 hour of transport from the lake. The yellow line is 1 to 2 hours, and the gold line is 2 to 3 hour transport. And the particles stay in the atmosphere. The biggest particles, the ones that are too big to really interact with your body, fall out during this transport. But the PM10 and the PM2.5, especially the PM2.5, can remain in the atmosphere for hours to days, and the PM2.5 can stay in the atmosphere for weeks. So it will be transported. Now, sometimes these dust events are associated with rain, and I've never seen it rain mud until I moved to Utah. And you can tell when one of these events has happened with a rain event because the next day everybody's at the car wash and the line is crazy. So that's another economic benefit of the lake. Invest in car washes until we get this taken care of. And then you've seen this in Sarah Goneski's talk about the communities that are most impacted by Great Salt Lake if it continues to shrink. And I just wanted to point out that the numbers on here are for PM 2.5. We've done the modeling for PM10, but it hasn't been published yet. And the impacts on PM10 are even bigger than what we see here. And I just want to note that, yes, the communities to the south and to the east of the lake are ones that are heavily impacted. But to the north of the Farmington Bay is an area that is rapidly developing. People are building their homes within literally a couple hundred yards of the lake bed. And that's development is just continuing up there. So what do we have to monitor? Well, let's just do a quick comparison. This is coming from the Great Salt Lake Strike Team report. I'm a member of the Great Salt Lake Strike Team. And we have sister lakes in California, Owens Dry Lake and Salton Sea, both of which are suffering significant air quality challenges associated with blowing dust. And just look at the response for the number of monitors that have been put in place to try and protect human health at Owens Lake. You can take Owens Lake, and if you translate it to Great Salt Lake, it actually fits into Farmington Bay with room left over. And California has 8 monitors on the lake periphery and 1 in the surrounding community, and there are 25,000 residents in the Owens Lake Valley. If you look at the Salton Sea is bigger. It would fill Farmington Bay and Ogden Bay. It doesn't have as much exposed playa yet, but it will before long because California has written off the Salton Sea. And they have 14 monitors, 8 of which are on the periphery of the lake, and the other 6 are in the surrounding communities. And then we look at what Utah has currently with Great Salt Lake. We had 4 monitors that were in place, and then due to a better understanding of the dust issue, recently added 2 red ones there, and those are the first ones that are actually within 15 miles of the lake. So that's progress. In terms of the population, though, Owens Lake 25,000, Salton Sea 250,000, Great Salt Lake and Wasatch Front 2.5 million. So there's definitely a need for increased monitoring. And just to visually show the difference in the population. We've got a lot of people to take care of here, like the students at that 4th grade elementary said. And Pat Bagley basically does a good job of scaring the heck out of everybody. This is true. But guys, let's go to the scariest, most terrifying attraction in Utah, Great Salt Lake. I'm terrified too, but not for the reason that you think. I might have determined and discovered that there were heavy metals in the lake bed dust that I don't really want to spend a lot of time breathing. But what really scares me is that 5 years from now, if we don't institute monitoring, I still won't be able to answer the basic questions that we all need of what are the concentrations, who's being impacted, what can we do about it. Those are the things that scare me. But I'm optimistic because of the people in this room and the people in the state legislature and the people in our government agencies and the public sentiment that we cannot fail. We must absolutely save Great Salt Lake because we are the lake. Mm.
Thank you, Kevin. The remainder of this presentation will be handled as a conversation among the panelists in front of you. In addition to Professors Perry and Abbott, we will be joined by Director Tim Davis. Until quite recently, Tim had been the Deputy Great Salt Lake Commissioner, and within the last month, he was appointed to be Director of Utah's Department of Environmental Quality, the state department charged with addressing air pollution for the state. We're also joined by Professor Karrigan Börk. Karrigan is an environmental law professor whose scholarship focuses primarily on water law and natural resources. He teaches at the University of California, Davis. He's also director at that university of the Center for Watershed Sciences, or co-director, I guess. Finally, we have Professor Beth Parker joining us. Beth is an adjunct professor of law and policy, and she is the law and policy lead of the Great Salt Lake Project. The Great Salt Lake Project is something that Beth and I co-founded that is trying to answer the pressing question, what can Utah do to solve the Great Salt Lake crisis. Her expertise is air pollution law, water law, and tribal law. Tim, I'm going to start with you. Before the presentation, Tim said, I'm going to sit in the middle so everybody can hit me, which is just perfect. So I'm going to go to you first. The writing's on the wall, I guess. So, Director Davis, I would like for you to talk about how the state is responding to the issue of Great Salt Lake dust, including any initiatives that came from the recent session of the legislature.
Thanks, Brig. First, I want to thank Kevin for sitting next to me, so you can't tell which one of us is Tim and which one of us is Kevin. So if you want to throw anything, throw it at that Tim. It's very useful to have my doppelganger here. Or I'm his doppelganger. So I think if you're going to talk about what the state has done, I think we have to go back to and Ben showed one of the slides and the websites that I live and die by, which is the current lake level. I may have a little OCD on that and checking it over and over. Even since the last 3 weeks since I left the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's office, I still check it all the time. So in 2022, the lake reached its lowest recorded level ever. But even before that, the legislature started taking action, creating the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan. In 2023, creating the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office, and it always felt very, navel-gazing and self-serving to point that out when I was in the office, but now I can say it with, to create a strategic plan for the lake, and that includes addressing the dust. And the legislature the state has invested tens of millions of dollars in studying the Great Salt Lake, including dust, and conserving, dedicating, and delivering water to the lake. Because the easiest thing, even though, as Kevin pointed out, that getting the lake into the healthy range that the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office established, the 1498 to 4205, still leaves potentially up to 70% of dust spots, or 30% uncovered. Is it the other inverse? It's inverse. Okay, inverse. So 70% uncovered. It's still that's progress on addressing dust. More immediately, the Division of Water Resources hired the University of Utah, entered into a contract with the University of Utah, Kevin and his colleagues, in order to do a study of to gather more information about mitigation, dust hotspots, and the costs of mitigating different mitigation scenarios. That also included funding from the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office. As Kevin pointed out, the Division of Air Quality received funding several legislative sessions ago to add those additional dust monitors. And then this last legislative session, and I've heard a lot about the governor's office had requested $651,000 to improve how the department and the Division of Air Quality is able to monitor, measure, analyze, and take steps to address dust issues, including around Utah, but including Great Salt Lake. We did receive $150,000, the most important piece of that requested funding, for a staff person to be dedicated to this issue. So that was a win coming out of a legislative session when a lot of things did not get funded. And then I don't think it's called extortion, but I have talked to Commissioner Brian Steed, Great Salt Lake Commissioner Brian Steed, to make sure that the Commissioner's Office, with funding they have, will help provide additional monitors for the lake that we didn't get this time with the Governor's request. So we plan to move forward with, right now, the Division of Air Quality is working on a proposal, or two proposals, for that funding, for increased monitoring. And we'll work with the University of Utah and others to help make sure that we're using that funding as well as we can. One of the things that we're really trying to understand with all the studies, the increased monitoring, the new staff person, is what risks does the dust pose to human health? How can it be best mitigated? how do we avoid a non-attainment under the Clean Air Act for PM10 that you've heard a lot about? How do we, as Utahns, stay in control of solving this problem for ourselves without having to have EPA come in? That's one of my goals, is how do we do this? How do we get ahead of it so people are safe, so people don't have to worry about living here in the future? And we're committed to getting there. So I think and I have the unique position, having been the deputy commissioner of the Great Salt Lake and now executive director of DQ, that we're fully committed. I'm fully committed to solving this problem and figuring out how we get there. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, I mentioned to a number of people I couldn't imagine a better pick for that position than you, Tim. So glad that you're there. I'd like to now turn to Professor Beth Parker. Beth, would you be willing to talk to us about how, if at all, Great Salt Lake dust is regulated by the Federal Clean Air Act?
Yes, I would love to, and I will try to do it without making everybody's eyes glaze over. Just start waving your hands if it gets really boring. But this is actually really important. It's a really important conversation to have. And so I teach air pollution law and policy here at the law school, and I usually end the course on the last day of our class. We'll talk about Great Salt Lake dust and pollution, because even for students who aren't native Utahns, they've become aware of it by the time they're second and third year law students, and generally have strong feelings. In fact, I've had over the course of a couple classes, 4 students write their final papers on Great Salt Lake and the Clean Air Act. So to fully understand the Clean Air Act's potential role in addressing Great Salt Lake's crisis, which we've heard about from Sarah Graneski, Tim, Kevin, and Ben, we first have to understand the purpose of the Clean Air Act. And the purpose of the Clean Air Act is to safeguard and improve the nation's air quality and protect public health and welfare. So there are kind of few purposes woven into the act writ large, and then there are other purposes that are folded into subsections of the act. So there actually is a really important subsection that relates directly to Great Salt Lake. So the Clean Air Act does a lot of things. We heard earlier in the first panel about its successes. It's not perfect, but it has done a really good job of cleaning up our nation's air. If you look at pre-1970 and some of the really bad smog events like Denora, Pennsylvania, a couple smog events in New York where lots of people died due to smog. So the Clean Air Act has it charges EPA to set certain standards, and these standards are called National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So ambient in the outdoor air. The Clean Air Act doesn't regulate indoor air pollution or air emissions, just those that are found in the ambient air. And these NAAQS, these National Ambient Air Quality Standards that are set, have a primary purpose, and the primary purpose of the NAAQS is to protect public health. And these standards are set to protect public health. And then there's a secondary purpose, which is to protect public welfare. So think about the environment, animals, crops, damage to homes, and general just quality of life. That's public welfare juxtaposed to public health. So under this NAAQS program, these national standards, EPA has identified 6 main pollutants that it sets these sort of standards for. And it does other things, but we're going to focus on these standards here relating to the lake. These are called criteria pollutants, and you have sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, lead, and then ground level ozone. And we heard about some of these earlier today. We're going to focus on particulate matter as we talk about the lake. So dust storms originating from the lake are a quintessential example of particulate matter pollution. And I think this was explained earlier, but particulate matter pollution are these very, very small particles, about between 1/7 and 1/10 the size of a human hair. That's PM10. And then PM2.5 is an even smaller particle that's a quarter the size of PM10. So Ben told us about why the lake is declining, primarily due to human diversions and overuse of the tributaries that would feed the lake, somewhere around 2/3 due to human involvement. And then you have climatic variability and climate change as well. But it's no question that the lake is retreating. We have between 800 and 1,000 square miles of exposed lake bed. That is a lot of space. And we'll talk a little bit later about a lake in California that has 110 exposed, well, it's 110 square miles, and it is become very problematic under the Clean Air Act. So as Kevin mentioned, as the water levels have decreased, we have an increase of these hotspots, and we have an increase in the severity and frequency of dust events, where wind whips across the exposed bed of the lake and carries the dust to communities near and sometimes far. And we have to think about health because of the primary purpose of these standards. So the health implications, as we heard from Sarah Graneski and our earlier panel on health pollution with John Lynn and Dr. Payne, the health implications of this crisis cannot be overstated. Great Salt Lake dust, particulate matter dust specifically, has devastating health impacts. It's so small, it can go really far into your lungs, into your tissues, and cause a whole host of problems that we won't go over because we've heard about before. But in an earlier panel, someone brought up the impact of personal stories. And here I'd like to just pause really quickly and share a personal story of Great Salt Lake dust impacting my family. So I have 5 children. 4 of my 5 children are asthmatic. I have adult onset asthma, most likely the doctor thinks because I've lived in Utah my entire life. And when you become pregnant, you can pass these on to your children. So 4 of my 5 children are asthmatic, 2 have severe asthma. And all fourth graders in Utah take a field trip to Great Salt Lake. And a few years back, my current 7th grader, I accompanied him and his class to a field trip to the shores of Great Salt Lake. And this was in spring of 2022. And November of 2022 is when we fell to our all-time low. It was a pretty mild day, but there were people walking around and some dust started to kick up, and there was just a little bit of a breeze. And my son had an acute asthma attack right there on the shores of Great Salt Lake. And we weren't talking a huge dust storm, lots of heavy winds. This was just some of the dust that was kicked up. Luckily, we had his inhaler. We were able to avert real disaster, but it just really hit home and shows how much this dust can and will and already does affect us. So anyway, for each criteria pollutant, the Clean Air Act tells the EPA to classify areas of the country into non-attainment, attainment, or maintenance. Non-attainment means you exceed these standards. Attainment means you're under these standards, that air quality is pretty good. And maintenance means you have been in non-attainment, but now you've gone into attainment. You have to subscribe to about a 10-year plan. And this is something Tim now knows lots about because DEQ oversees Division of Air Quality here in Utah. But I want to pause and talk about Great Salt Lake as a unique pollution source. So you'll have point sources when you're talking about the Clean Air Act, and traditional PM sources, particulate matter sources, think of things like factories, power plants, also come from cars, but lots of these point sources that have one source emitting pollutants can be fitted with filters, scrubbers. Great Salt Lake can't be fitted with a scrubber or a filter, right? So it's a unique source, and we'll talk a little bit about Owens Lake, but that is the largest single source of PM10 pollution in the United States. It's 1/15 the size of Great Salt Lake. And rather than put more water back into the lake, they've decided to mitigate the dust, and it's come at a really high cost to both health and the economy. But there are huge implications about whether an area is designated as in attainment or non-attainment. So basically, if we go into non-attainment for PM10 here in Utah, Tim's life will get a lot harder. We could see we will have to have increased regulations on vehicles, on industries. There could be a whole host of regulations. We could be required to have dust mitigation projects. And this, of course, would be overseen by the state and Tim and Bryce Bird, who we're going to hear from tomorrow. But it doesn't stop there. There are federal backstops as well. So in addition to these higher regulations, if the dust from the lake gets bad enough, and we go into non-attainment for PM10, we're already in non-attainment in lots of areas for PM2.5. And if we get worse there or go into non-attainment for PM10, there are also federal backstops. So we could have the federal government, this doesn't happen often, but could come in and take the reins away from the state. We could have sanctions. So to motivate states to come into compliance with the Clean Air Act, EPA can levy sanctions. A common penalty is taking away federal highway funds. I know that seems odd, but it actually is a really big driver to get states to come into compliance. There's also something called a citizen suit. So the act empowers citizens to be able to sue. They can sue industries or EPA to officially designate an area as in non-attainment. So there are lots of reasons why we should try to solve this problem, most of which we've already talked about, but the Clean Air Act is a big one. Notably, though, the Clean Air Act won't mandate the state to put more water back into the lake. It will just squeeze the state. So then the state will maybe up regulations rather than using voluntary measures and incentives to get more water to the lake. So as Tim mentioned, really the easiest way to avoid some real pain here is to get more water to the lake.
Thank you, Beth. That was a master class. Thank you. Let's now turn to Professor Börk. And first of all, thank you for making the long journey to join us. Here's the question I have for you, though. Tim mentions directly that trying to avoid non-attainment was one of the goals. And avoiding the kinds of pains that Beth identified may be part of that. Not just, I'm not trying to put thoughts into your head, but as a rational thinker, that's where I think I would be going if I were you. But one of the questions I have here is, what other legal challenges might we see that, just briefly, we won't really focus on these a lot, but a diminished Great Salt Lake, what other kinds of challenges might that scenario pose?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Real pleasure to be here to speak with you all about this. When I think about this question, I kind of think about like you said, these things that could happen that would take local democratic control away from the people of Utah to solve this problem that I think people here really want to solve and solve in a particularly Utah kind of way. And so one of the big ones that's hanging out there is the Endangered Species Act. Coming from California, I can tell you a lot about living with water systems that are full of endangered species and what that does for managing those systems. It's not pretty. It's hard. So about a year ago now, the Center for Biological Diversity and a couple other groups listed or petitioned the Fish and Wildlife Service to list the Wilson's phalarope under the Endangered Species Act. And if that happens, then we have a species that's really dependent on the Great Salt Lake and the Great Salt Lake ecosystem that suddenly has these Endangered Species Act protections. There's three main portions of the Endangered Species Act that would come into play here that we want to think about. That's Section 7, Section 9, and Section 10. And Section 7, we'll start there, says that it's really aimed at federal actions. And it says that any federal action that could potentially push this species into jeopardy of going extinct has to have a formal biological opinion from the expert agency. In this case, that'd be the Fish and Wildlife Service, that tells the federal agency whether that federal action would in fact jeopardize the continued existence of that species. If it would, your project's pretty much not going to happen. You can petition for the God Squad to meet, which can exempt a particular project. That sounds more exciting than it is. It's only happened 3 times, so it's a pretty uncommon thing for them even to meet. And of those 3 times, there's never been a kind of clear-cut exemption of the project. They may have exempted parts of a couple of projects, but generally, that's not the saving grace. You can get some suggestions from the Fish and Wildlife Service about how you may change actions, and that again takes that kind of control away, in this case from federal agencies. But I keep saying federal agencies and people are like, that's the feds, we don't need to worry about it. In a lot of cases you do, because they're such an integral part of the water system. So Bureau of Reclamation, for example, the FERC relicensing actions for federal hydropower, essentially any federal water projects. Corps of Engineers falls under that heading as well. Any road building that would go on in an area that might affect these birds. It just complicates the heck out of anything. So both direct federal actions, federal permits. So anytime you're asking a federal agency for a permit for a private action, if you're filling wetlands on your property that are still regulated under the Clean Water Act, then you're getting a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, and it has to comply with the Endangered Species Act. And even funding, so funds from the federal government, them giving those funds to someone are a federal action that again require compliance with Section 7. And what that compliance means is when the Fish and Wildlife Service is studying this project, they develop a formal biological opinion, a BIOP. You may have heard that term float around. And these BIOPs are big deals. There's a lot of science that goes into these. This is going to be particularly hard in the next 4 years with our stripped down science agencies. It means these are going to take even longer to write. The big water project in California is the Central Valley project that's operated by the Bureau of Reclamation. They periodically come up with new plans about how they're going to operate that. Last time they developed a new plan, it took the first Trump administration 4 years to write the BIOP to approve that plan. That was promptly held up in court. And then the Biden administration took another 4 years to write a new BIOP. So we're talking about federal agencies studying big problems in lots of detail, and it just takes time. It takes a lot of time to do this. And so that affects federal agencies directly, private actions indirectly when they're permitted or funded by the federal government. The other place that we really think about this is Section 9 of the Endangered Species Act. In Section 9, it says that once a species is listed, you can't take that species. And take is one of these technical legal terms that means a whole lot of stuff. Basically, it means you can't do anything that might bug the species. That's kind of, I think, where it boils down to. It says harass and annoy, but one of the big ones is habitat protection. You can't take habitat if destroying that species' habitat is going to keep that species from being able to reproduce, for example, or deprive that species of the food it needs on its migration, which is the key piece for these shorebirds. And so that directly affects private actions by all of us, right? You couldn't go out and harass one of these shorebirds after it was listed. It also affects the state. The state can't directly take these species or indirectly take them through modifying habitat. And this has both civil liability and criminal liability. You can get locked up for violating the Endangered Species Act. So there's a really heavy federal hammer there that's kind of poised if this species gets listed. And then Section 10 is the permitting to allow people to violate Section 9, essentially. You can get a permit to take those species by going through this Section 10 process. But if you're a private landowner, to do that, to get permission to take that species, or a state, or a city, or a state government agency, you have to come up with a habitat conservation plan that says how you're going to protect the species, how you're going to minimize and mitigate the impacts to that listed species, and that takes a long time, and that's really expensive to do. Right. So those are the kind of core protections of the Endangered Species Act. If you want to know what that means in practice, talk to the people who are trying to manage the Colorado River. Right, talk to the people who are trying to manage the flows on the Green River to protect the Colorado pike minnow, to protect the razorback sucker. I've got a picture of the razorback sucker on my water bottle. Or I can tell you about what it's like in California. We have not had a plan to operate the state and federal projects that hasn't been litigated ever. Every time it gets locked up in litigation. We were in litigation before the first Trump administration rewrote its biological opinion. That went promptly into litigation from the state, from several environmental groups. That litigation got stayed and kind of kept bumping along during the Biden administration. New plan came out, and they got sued under the Endangered Species Act. So when a species gets listed, you're really inviting a heavy federal hand in to control what the state's able to do, and you're giving all the environmental groups a real hook to go after actions and to hold these things up, to really make sure people comply with the Endangered Species Act. And there's a good reason for that. Like, we believe that we should be protecting these species. These things are super important. There's all kinds of reasons to do that, right? There's religious reasons, there's ecological reasons, protecting our ecosystem ideas that they are a good signal to us that we're in trouble if they're in trouble, right? So good reasons to do it, but it's also a huge pain. And so if you get this thing in place here, it's going to fundamentally change the way that this is managed. There's a couple others. I can keep talking if you want. We got the public trust, which could constrain or empower the state to take actions. We've even got the Clean Water Act, but maybe I can wait and bring those up with some other questions.
We may follow up on some of those, and we may have some audience members that are interested in hearing more about them. I want to take just a kind of a break in the conversation. We're not going to stop, but Beth and I had the pleasure of sitting down with Kevin Perry a few weeks ago. We just wanted to find out what it was like to be Kevin Perry and to study dust the way he's studied it, and he agreed that he could talk to us a little bit about his experience. And one of the questions that kind of I walked away for the first time I had some clarity: how big is that lake bed, that exposed lake bed? I mean, people will say it's the size of Maui, but it's not like I brought a measuring tape and measured Maui. That doesn't help me either. I've heard 800 square miles, 1,000 square miles, but very few people could talk about it the way you have. Can we pull up the secret slide? Go ahead. Kevin, you can tell us what's going on here.
Riding my bicycle along Farmington Bay, I'm hauling a portable wind tunnel at this point, but I think there's a drone footage coming up here. We'll just show the sheer scale of one small section of the lake being Farmington Bay. And there's an example of dust hotspot that I'm getting ready to measure out there as well. But it's desolate, it's huge, and never ending right now. Hopefully that'll change in the future.
Talk to us, how long did it take you? So you actually, tell us about your measurements, and we know all this stuff about the lake, the arsenic and the dust and all this. They don't understand people don't understand what had to happen in order to get that. What had to happen?
I had to be brain damaged? No, I'm an atmospheric scientist, and I wanted to answer questions about the dust coming off Great Salt Lake. So what would an atmospheric scientist normally do? Well, you would set up on the shore of Great Salt Lake, and you'd be in the right place at the right time when a dust event came off, and you'd have all your equipment in place, and you would sample the heck out of it. But this is enormous, and it's not like the entire lake bed lets go at once. There's a section here and a section there, and getting close to the lake bed is a real challenge, and then finding electricity is even a bigger challenge. And so I decided to basically do a soil survey of the entire lake bed on bicycle and bring the soil back to the lab so that I could then dry it, suspend it, resuspend it, and pull out the PM10 stuff that actually ends up in your lungs. But it's an odyssey, and if I'd known how hard it was when I started, frankly, I probably wouldn't have done it. It took me 26 months, 20 miles a day on average, 150 plus trips out to Great Salt Lake in less than ideal conditions, heat, bugs, mud. About 10% of the lake was unrideable on the bicycle, and you had to push the bike, which doesn't sound like a lot, but I bicycled 2,300 miles, and it means I pushed the darn bike 230 miles. Go do that for fun.
Yeah. Wow.
Brig, could I add just one thing about
Yes.
Kevin's bike? So when we went and interviewed him, we asked, kind of like little children, can we see the bike? Yeah. And actually his first bike broke. The conditions were so difficult. But he brought us in and showed us his next bike. And he said, oh, it's light. And I picked it up and I thought, that's not like my road bike. This is a heavy duty bike. He had to pull a trailer full of water and then replace that water with the sediment that he would measure. And I want you to close your eyes and think about a day in late July, July 22nd, one of the hottest days of the year. Picture riding 20 miles out on this desiccated playa, no shade. To get shade, he'd lie under his bike for a little bit to get some rest. And it was such a huge act of service for all of the folks in Utah along the Wasatch Front in the region. So thank you, Kevin.
Yeah. We will. Kevin is a hero, and literally one of the very few people who can say he almost took a bullet for the lake. You'll have to ask him about that. Literally. Okay. Maybe people want to hear that about the Q&A. I think that I am really interested, Karrigan, in talking more about some of the sticks that might be out there, but I think the thing that people really hunger for are the solutions. Right? We all know about the problems. We might not know them the way that Ben Abbott knows them. We might not know them the way that Kevin Perry knows them or Tim Davis knows them. But we know that the lake is a problem. The question is, what can we do? Or even more desperately, what can we do to save our home? Right? Like that's the question I hear a lot. Let's talk about that as a panel. Tim, do you want to start?
Sure. So I'm going to put on my former hat, the deputy commissioner hat, and the commissioner's office has, for the last almost 3 years now, been working on, or I guess 2 years now, has been working on a strategic plan for long-term plan for the lake. It's 30 years. We really looked out 30 years. The first year was last year. The short term was last year, which was really looking at building upon the actions that were already moving in place. The medium term, which is what we're in now, the commissioner's office has been working on a plan for the up to 2034, and really trying to focus on where do we think we can realistically change, get an inflection point on the amount of water getting to the lake levels, and take a long term. And we haven't shown you a long term trend of the lake. And you'll see in the 80s, if you look at that long term trend, really big water years. The first year I saw the lake was 1983, which was a good year to see the lake. But if you go back to 1902, there's a long-term trend of the lake levels falling. So it's not just a 20-year drought, it's long-term. And so we were trying to figure out, the commissioner's office has been trying to figure out, how do you get that inflection point? When Ben was saying that no one's done this before, how do we begin to fill the lake again? How do we begin to, in that short term, between now and when we get the lake back up to at least an intermediate target, which the commissioner's office set for a level of 4195, which we did hit last year. And if you talk to people felt like the things that, I mean, that is a significant change from where we were in 2022. And so that's kind of the short-term goal. How do we get there and be able to sustain, ideally, kind of at that level more often, and then continue to work long-term to get enough water to the lake to get back to the healthy range, and at the same time be taking steps to mitigate dust hotspots that are not getting covered. So we're exploring that as well. So the number one thing that we need to be doing is working with all water users across the state to conserve, dedicate, and deliver water to the lake. There's been a lot of investment, a lot of work on conserving water within the Great Salt Lake Basin and in Utah. There hasn't been as much work to dedicate and deliver that conserved water to the lake. And that has to be from everybody. That has to be from cities, that has to be from water districts, that has to be from companies, that has to be from our friends in the, and this is all voluntary, friends who are farmers and ranchers. It has to be everybody doing what they can to conserve, dedicate, and deliver water to the lake. And that 250,000 acre feet that Ben talked about, that's where we, at least on modeling that Dr. Tarbot at Utah State University has done, that may get us in by 2034, that inflection point where we go from that long-term, from 1902 downward trend and begin to fill it again. That would be a huge triumph over the next 10 years. It took decades, over 120 years for just looking to 1902 now to get here. It's not going to be fixed in the short term, but it really, it's every year, and Director Hasenjager of the Division of Water Resource just talked about this too. We need to make sure that we're conserving water every year, all across the state, but we especially need in the Great Salt Lake Basin to conserve, dedicate, and deliver water every year, more water to the lake, and do it in a voluntary fashion so that we bring everybody along with us.
That's a great start. That's a great start. What else can be done? What can be done?
I'd just like to add one thing to that one, is that it's really, really difficult to do all of those sorts of things in a drought year, which is why we have to take advantage of when we get a good snowpack, we have to use that opportunity to deliver that water to Great Salt Lake.
I think one really important thing that we need to do, which Tim touched on, is we do need to change our culture and our mindset. We need to have a really robust education program. For those of you who read the news, you might feel oversaturation with stories about Great Salt Lake, but there are a lot of Utahns who don't know about what's going on at the lake and why the lake is important and how it could really, really affect them. But I think we really do need a culture shift and a mindset shift to realize that we don't live in England and we can't have yards, businesses, we can't operate like we're living somewhere that gets the amount of rain that we just don't get as the third most arid state in the nation. I think one thing we have to realize, the commissioner's report, the strategic plan put out by Tim Davis and Commissioner Steed, went through 5 things that any policy options have to sort of pass through. And Tim, tell me if I get this right. It needs to be technically feasible. Is it feasible? Lots of descriptors here. Technically feasible, ecologically sustainable, economically viable.
That's a hard
There
word.
we go. Legally sound and politically possible. So there we go. But we do raise the roof. Thank you. But some of these things are easier said than done, right? We do need, all of these solutions need to be politically possible. And if we look at sort of the Utah way and the Utah approach, it might be a little different than the California way and the California approach. You know, we might rely a little less on regulation, a little more on voluntary measures and incentives. There will be a huge push, hopefully in the coming years, hopefully soon, to really get our water banking program up and running. It is up and running, but to really get some of our water users to subscribe to this, we have a Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust in which water users can lease water. They don't have to sell their water to the lake. I think we'll see a lot of split season leasing. What this is if you picture alfalfa, and a lot of people will say, well, the problem is alfalfa. First of all, that's a mindset that does need to change somewhat. We all are part of the problem and we all need to be part of the solution. But if you think about your lawn and you think about watering it in May versus August, it takes a lot more water to keep it green and grow it long in August, right? So farmers and agriculturalists can do something called a split season lease, where they grow maybe the first 1, 2, 3 cuttings of alfalfa in the wetter months, and then third or fourth cutting, they lease their water to the lake and get compensated for that. So they're just some of the options on the table.
Right. I think kind of just zooming out for a second, like when I look at this situation, I see the same problem that's playing out across the West, which is that you have old water rights and new problems, right? You've got water rights that were established in many cases more than 100 years ago, 150 years ago at this point. In California, the vast majority of our water use is under rights that were established before 1914 or riparian rights that people got automatically. So most of these water rights are water rights that people got by posting a notice and using water. There was no public interest review. There was no environmental review. They got these property rights a long time ago. And now the values that we're trying to serve through our system, through our economic system, through our government system, through our laws is a very different approach. Right? When these were locked up, we lived in a very different world, pre-Civil War in a lot of cases, right? So you're looking at really old rights that are still controlling where our water flows, and oftentimes those flows don't line up with what we're trying to do now, what we think is important now. And so the question becomes how we reallocate that water, how we shift that water around. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. Right, but that's, to me, the core of most of our water fights. That's what's at the core of most of the water fights in California, and I think across the West, that's what we see. And there are command and control approaches to do that. The state has the authority in most cases, and I think looking at Utah law, the authority here to change those water rights, to take water from existing uses and say, just like we regulate land use, hey, you can't use this water during this part of the year. It's not reasonable. It's not reasonable to use water if using that water is going to make the lake so salty the brine shrimp can't survive. Right. So there is this backdrop, maybe you call it the California backdrop after hearing that before. But just like in California, that solution is often not tenable. We have a tremendously powerful agricultural lobby in California, and that means that you can't just regulate those rights in a way that's going to benefit the rest of the state. Right? Even if legally you have the power, you believe you have the power to do that, ultimately it's not that tenable solution. It's outside of the Overton window for people who play in the policy space. And the Overton window describes what's politically feasible. I think it's important to acknowledge that, because it forms the backdrop for a lot of these negotiations. Sometimes we say in California that conflict breeds cooperation. It's only after we fought about water for 30 or 40 years that we're able to get to a cooperative solution, because people start to understand, you know what, I'm better off finding a way to solve this problem. I don't think that you all have 30 or 40 years of fighting to go through. I don't think the lake can handle that. So I'm hopeful and cautiously optimistic that there's a faster way to get to that. But I think it's worth noting that this is a big fight that's going on across the country.
Brig, one of the things that I do want to point out is that, we've gotten to the place, the commissioner's office is at a place where there are staff actively working with people to conserve, dedicate, and deliver water to the lake. Conversations with cities, districts, farmers are going on right now, both through the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office, but also the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust is having those conversations too. So we are starting to learn how to do this. It's not something that we've done as a state. I mean, until a few years ago, it wasn't possible to legally move water rights to the lake for the benefit of the lake. So there's been a lot of change in a short amount of time. I oversaw all water rights in Montana for over 6 years before coming to Utah, and I can tell you, water right law doesn't change very fast. It's pretty Byzantine. And so just in the last 4 or 5 years, the fact that we've made significant strides, now we're in the how do we do it, boots on the ground. The commissioner's office has staff that are beginning to do that. There are others working to find solutions as well outside of the government. But it's going to take time, but we're no longer, the state is no longer just thinking about how to do this or setting up the process. We're out saying, how does it work? Is it working? What the programs that have been in place, and what needs to change to make, if not, what needs to change in the future? So those kind of negotiations, those kind of solutions are happening. We just need to make sure they happen in a voluntary fashion, in a way and a speed that addresses the problem before the issues get worse.
Yeah, and I would just add, you can't negotiate with hydrology, and we don't get an A for effort. Right, it really depends on not how many dollars were spent on this, but how much water got to the lake. And so to be able to ground truth these solutions, which really are unprecedented and extremely innovative, we need to be investing orders of magnitude more money in this than we are. And for me, I think the number one thing that we could do is increase that investment. Former legislator often points out we spend $1 billion or more each year on roads. This year we're spending $1.1 million on Great Salt Lake, and So it's not that we don't have enough money in the budget, it's just the priority's not there. And I got a call a couple days ago from somebody that many of you know, but I didn't ask her if I could mention her name, so I won't. But she called and she said, "Hey, Ben, I think that Utahns have stopped praying for Great Salt Lake." And you could laugh at that for a bunch of reasons, but actually it makes me feel really seriously. Because what we pray for is what we care about. What we pray for is what we're working for. And so far, the thing that's made the biggest difference for the lake is the prayers that we're given, right? If we look at the actual level of the lake, we can't yet measure the effectiveness of any of the programs that are in place. We can't detect it. We can detect the 2 big winters that we got. And if we've taken our eye off the ball, then we're in trouble. Now, the polling shows that the public still really cares about this. 80% of Utahns just this year said that they were concerned about Great Salt Lake. 90% more than are concerned say that they want more action on the lake. So for me, we've got the public interest and support. We've got to figure out how to translate that into governmental priorities so that we can really be testing these programs, see which ones are going to be winners and which ones are not going to bear fruit.
Thank you, Ben. I would just say one just sort of qualifier, right? And this is hard. You know, the government is a they and not an it. And when you start thinking about what's going on, there are parts of the government that are doing a lot, right? So I think about the commissioner's office. It would be hard for me to say that the commissioner's office doesn't put this as a very high priority and isn't working tirelessly to get this done and isn't doing a great job, all those things, right? But I mean, I guess what you're trying to say is scoreboard, though.
I think that's right, and I'm not actually criticizing anyone about this. Steve Clyde, who many of you know, has said we've come light years in a really short order. And I think it's helpful, Beth, what you mentioned about alfalfa, right? We're going to lose, and Karrigan, what you mentioned about 40 years of litigation, we're going to lose that solidarity if we don't share the credit. And in fact, let's give the credit to those who are in power, right? They're working on this. And then we also need to recognize that there's light years yet to go. And if you heard Steve on the panel last week, we thought he was going to be the optimistic one, and instead he said we didn't get anything from this last session. And again, I'm not imputing bad intent, but we need every year. I don't think that anyone who's familiar with the issue feels like we have the pieces in place to fix it, right? We need to wait for the programs that are in place to bear fruit while also innovating and testing out new things. We need to do both.
Okay. Beth, I saw the Slido kind of by you a moment ago. Can you pass that? Yeah, I'm going to start looking at the... here's one more question, though, just as I'm pulling this up. What can we learn from other approaches? Or, saline lakes, we see a lot of problems, but are there lessons that we could learn? I mean, other than no one's doing it.
The thing that I'd say very shortly is augmentation doesn't work, right? So the first thought that many people have is there's not enough water. Let's try to seed the clouds. Let's try to build pipelines, or let's try to re-engineer the lake so that it needs less water. And that has only accelerated the decline of these lakes. We saw, Tim and I attended an International Saline Lakes Conference in Turkey late last year. And the delegation from Iran showed the billions of dollars that they spent, among other things, building a new river through the desert. And then the last slide of their presentation was, and here's what's happened to the lake since, right? And the lake just cratered. And this is a rule for water security globally, start with conservation. We have to learn to live within our means rather than believe down the road we're going to get some windfall or have an increase in runoff.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to visit Owens Lake in October and to see the engineered solutions that they have implemented to try and minimize dust. And in addition to costing more than $2.5 billion for an area that's smaller than Farmington Bay, it also made the lake bed and the ecosystem unrecognizable. I was riding on the bus through the area and I looked out the window and I saw an area that looked a lot like the playa at Great Salt Lake. And I drew attention to this saying, oh, that looks just like Great Salt Lake. And they said, yeah, that's the 1% of the lake bed that we haven't mitigated. And really, when you see the mechanisms that they've tried to do in terms of shallow flooding and diking and using gravel and doing tillage and making roughing the surface, it just makes it a completely foreign type of environment. And I really think that we're better served by focusing on what we call the nature-based solution, which is the just add water.
Yeah.
Brig, if I could.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, let's. Just add water. It's a really great way to look at it. Just to back up on Owens Lake a little bit, for those of you who are not familiar with Owens Lake, so Owens Lake is a lake that's about 220 miles north of Los Angeles. It's about 110 square miles, and juxtapose that with Great Salt Lake, which is traditionally about 1,700 square miles. And it is, I mentioned this earlier, but I want to hit it home. It is, well, okay, in 1913, LA diverted water from Owens Lake to Los Angeles, and by 1926, the lake was dry. And despite spending $2.5 billion in mitigation efforts that Kevin just described, Owens Lake was and still is the largest single source of PM10 pollution in the nation. It emits 300 tons of PM10 pollution a year. 30 tons of that is arsenic and 10 is cadmium. So this is something EPA said. They said it's not a natural source, noting that it is humans that diverted the water, and wind speeds are not unusually high that cause these dust events. So I think that, like Kevin said, hearing about what's happened to Owens Lake, I think can encourage us to try to do what we can to conserve, dedicate, and direct water to the lake.
Can I? Oh, please, Tim.
So I do think, I mean, right now, Kevin and the U team are looking at what is the expense, what is the cost of doing different mitigation efforts. But as Beth and Kevin said, it's not only has LA Department of Power and Water spent $2.6 billion to date, they're spending $100 million a year going forward. It's cheaper and easier for us to get ahead of this, to mitigate it up front, right, and figure out just add water. And as Kevin said, during big water years, and Ben has indicated this too, during big water years, let's make sure we can get as much water to the lake, because that's when it's not going to harm other water uses too. And then the third big tool is we have a accidental engineered structure called the Union Pacific Causeway that cuts the lake between the North Arm and South Arm in half. We saw what happened when that was closed in 2023. And you saw that huge spike. The lake went up 5.5 feet in that year. How do we use that adaptively? Right now, the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands is working on, they were funded to come up with an engineered solution for the breach between that, and figuring out how do we adaptively manage salt as well as water between those arms. And so that's something we need to continue to explore, because we may be able to hold back at times more water in the South Arm before it's exported to the North Arm, and figuring out what is that balance. All these tools, how do they fit together, what works, what doesn't, and continue to iterate as we go forward.
Excellent. Thank you.
Brig, do you want a Mono Lake?
Yeah.
Quick overview?
Yeah, I would also like you to, you zoomed out for a minute and you said, let's think about this from the bigger picture. I'd love for you to kind of think about maybe not even other saline lakes, but how do we get, when we have freshwater scarcity, how are we getting water? Like what things have actually made a difference in the West?
Yeah, great question. So I think going back, Tim, to something you said, that these are Byzantine systems that take a long time to change. I think that's true, except at certain inflection points when it's not. Right. I think in Utah, you've got the creation of the modern water permitting system in 1903. You went from really an unpermitted system to a permitted system. You had the creation, the regulation of groundwater rights all of a sudden in the 1920s. California didn't regulate groundwater rights until just over a decade ago. It was us in Texas left, which is funny bedfellows. People could use whatever they wanted out of the groundwater, and then poof, you couldn't. And that's been a decade of local organizations figuring out how they want to control their groundwater. One of the other big watershed moments for us was the kind of, birth of the modern public trust doctrine in the Mono Lake, the Mono Lake litigation in 1983. Public trust is this broad idea that there are certain resources that are so precious to us, to the public, that the state, the government holds them in trust for us and protects them on our behalf. The state has the power to manage those resources and cannot convey them away, can't give them away. I'm not making this up. This is a pretty I'd call it a well-established and ill-defined concept. The federal Supreme Court has talked about this a lot. They kind of gave us the original modern public trust doctrine in a case about Illinois Central Railroad, about a harbor in Chicago, and said that the state couldn't just convey that away because it was one of these public trust resources. And so what the Mono Lake case was really about was integrating this idea of the public trust with water law. And the Supreme Court of California said, hey, these waters that you're letting people use under water rights are a public trust resource, and it's not something the state can convey away without keeping a supervisory responsibility over. And that let the state come in then and change how much water LA, again, was taking out of the Mono Lake Basin in order to bring water back into the basin. On the broader Lake Saline Lake things, we're still about 10 feet short, and it's pretty well stalled out. So we've got another water board hearing coming this year. Problem certainly isn't solved, but that tool, that public trust tool, has allowed for a lot of reallocation in California. But mostly what it does is to create a situation that brings people to the bargaining table. If you can go to somebody and say, hey, I'm going to file a public trust lawsuit against you, I might lose, but it's going to take 10 years and you're going to end up paying these water lawyers a lot. That means they may be willing to find another solution. And often that solution in California has been, how about you take some money instead of spending money? How about you take some money from me and you give me some of your water? All right, so we have these short-term leases in California that go through even in California, honestly, minimal environmental review. It's a way to get water moved very quickly for a season or for part of a season or for a year onto somebody else's land or into a river during the right part of the year or into a lake when the lake needs water. One of the other really creative solutions we've seen in California, and it's actually about wetlands, is that the Nature Conservancy runs this wetland program. I heard the name of it. Yeah, the Nature Conservancy, it's the bird returns program. So we've destroyed 95+% of the wetlands in the Central Valley. Birds need those wetlands when they're migrating. And farmers have land. They know how to manage their land way better than the government does, way better than Nature Conservancy does. And so the Nature Conservancy runs an auction every year that says, hey, we've got these bird populations. We think because we're monitoring them, they're going to be here this month in this place, and this is the kind of habitat they need. Farmers, what can we pay you to convince you to make your fields that habitat for these birds? So it's a reverse auction. So the farmers say, I can do that for $25 an acre. I could do that for $40 an acre. I could do that for $15 an acre. And then the Nature Conservancy takes those bids and figures out which of these are most helpful to us, which ones are closest to where the birds are going to be, which ones are most likely to provide the habitat that we need. And the farmers like it. They're in control of their land. They're getting paid to do something that's good for the community, which they want to do anyway. The Nature Conservancy likes it because they're getting kind of good bang for their buck. They're putting water back in. And so you can do something like that. Oregon actually uses this to put flows back into rivers. You could do this to put water back into the lake, right? It's about putting water into the lake. This is a way to figure out who's willing to part with that water cheaply, maybe because it's their last cutting of alfalfa that they don't really get a whole lot of profit from. Maybe it's more valuable because it's closer to the lake and it's more likely to actually get there, right? And so you can figure out what's the most valuable water and do it in the cheapest way possible.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. Thank you, Karrigan. One other just question I have. I think we talk a lot about what can be done. But the question I have walking out of here for today is, what should we do? It's different than what can be done. Ben, do you want to start?
I have at times spent a lot of emotional energy saying, why isn't legislature doing more on this? And instead, I think, can we adjust our thinking to what can we do together on this issue? And I think there's real appetite in the business community. There's real appetite among extremely politically diverse people. And a few years ago, there was a proposal to build Utah's largest city in the middle of Utah Lake. Some of you might have heard about this. It actually came down to a public trust dispute as well.
It was such a great idea, though, Ben. Didn't you just love it?
The environmentalists ruined the project, but it would have been amazing. What we saw...
For those of you who don't know, Ben got sued because he tried to stop that project. They picked on me because we, as a coalition, had political power, right? They had to take that risk of engaging in a lawsuit. And that was the turning point. I think we need a similar thing here. Where's the coalition? The 10,000, the 50,000, the 100,000 people that are willing to work together despite their differences to save Great Salt Lake, who are willing to talk to their neighbors, to work across the urban-rural divide and say, there's plenty of stuff that we don't agree on, but we love our home. Brig, I just appreciate how you said that. This is about love of our home. Are we going to rise to that level? And I think that we can do it. But there definitely is an added challenge because of the low public trust right now, not the doctrine, but trust of one another. And so the question that I ask myself each day is, what can we do to reduce that suspicion and build solidarity? And so that's probably not a great answer, but I have hope, I have faith. So let's do it.
So I think we have to act now, before we have issues with the Endangered Species Act, before we have a non-attainment under the Clean Air Act, before we have potentially a public trust ruling. I think we have to act now, and I think, and this is something that I learned in Turkey at the conference that Ben and I were at, and the example he gave of Lake Ermia, they seem to have started to make progress and then lost focus. And the political, even though it's not a democracy, for whatever reason, the regime in Iran lost focus on and no longer was putting resources in to save the lake, and that's when it began to collapse again. So we have to both act now while we have agency, do the things that we need to do to protect our air quality, protect our families, protect and save the lake. And we need to do it long enough that we don't forget about it, that we don't lose focus over time. So it's both immediate and long term. And that's what the Commissioner's Office tried to set up, but it's hard to do that. We don't stay focused on things as humans and as Americans. We have trouble staying focused on things for very long, but we have to do both. So that's what I would say.
Any other final words from our panelists?
One thing that Brig and I teach a couple Great Salt Lake Policy Accelerator classes, and we had one student who, at the beginning of one class, just once she learned about what was going on, she said, "This is my home, damn it. I want to save the lake." And I think, as Ben said, we do need to try to spread that sentiment. And one great thing about this being a primarily human-caused problem is that we as humans hold the keys to the solution. We just have to use those keys to open that lock. And it will take some adaptation. We'll all have to do our part. We as individuals with our grass and our yards, agriculturalists, municipalities, industry, there will have to be coordination, as Ben and Tim mentioned. We can all also try to influence our policymakers. That's huge if we let them know that this is something we care about. But I like to say the lake has been really good to us. It's time to treat the lake great.
Börk, I think, if I were in California and I was advising someone in California or a group of environmental folks in California about this, I'd tell them to turn the heat up, get species listed, file lawsuits, make things uncomfortable, make people really unhappy, right? And you breed that conflict and you push and you fight and you make things ugly. I don't think that's what is necessarily going to carry the day here, right? I think that's likely what's coming. We've seen the public trust lawsuit filed. We've seen the listing petition go in. So that's coming, but I don't think you want to end up there. So I think finding a way, recognize how much conflict is looming and how much of it is going to be outside of your control if that's where we end up, and take steps now to address this the way that you want to address it on your own terms, because when you lose that control, it's really hard to take it back.
Thank you. Dr. Dust, final words.
I just think back to that fourth grader that's counting on us, the adults in the room, to do something, and I don't want to let him down. So it's not that just that we should do, we have to do this.
Thank you all.
I want to thank you all for joining us today. As a reminder, we'll begin tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Before that, we welcome you to join us for a continental breakfast beginning at 8:30. And I'd like to just take a moment to have another round of applause for our incredible presenters today. I'd also like to thank the R. Harold Burton Foundation, our founding donor who's been with us for over 30 years, the Cultural Vision Fund, who makes this symposium and so many other events through the Stegner Center possible, as well as the Nature Conservancy of Utah, who has been a friend and supporter from the beginning. And finally, if you would take a moment to complete the survey that is on the Stegner Center Symposium website, we would be grateful. We really appreciate that feedback and try to continue to improve our programs year over year. And this year, a couple people who enter or who complete the survey will be entered into a prize drawing for a Stegner Center themed prize. And with that, we'll see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Thank you all.